Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock, tax depreciation super nerd, and we're talking to another super nerd today. I hope he doesn't mind me saying that. It's John Lindeman, who I consider one of the godfathers of property market research in Australia. And we've got him on today to talk about property market research basics. What sort of metrics he looks for to find booming markets, what sorts of things that he looks at as indicators for whether a property market's going to boom, and just some basic information to help property investors like yourself identify where the opportunities for them are. It's an awesome interview with John, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Here's John. John Lindeman, thank you for joining me back on the Geared for Growth podcast.
Hi, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello, everyone.
It's nice to see you again after a couple of years. We were just chatting off air. That was probably just pre-pandemic. And, of course, you were on the show with episode 115, so I definitely encourage people for a deep dive on your background as you know, really the godfather of property research in Australia, I think. But today we're taking, I guess, a smaller parcel of the whole property investing journey on, and that's really talking about property market research basics. Now, this is, of course, your bread and butter, but I wanted to see if I could steal a little bit of your secret herbs and spices for property investors that are either, new to the game or wanting to get into it. How do they actually research property markets to find where they should be purchasing?
How do people do the research? That's a very good question. I think, firstly, there's so much data out there that it's very easy to get blown away by all the numbers and statistics. And so I think you've really got to look at the market in two ways. One is as a top-down approach. In other words, what are the basic dynamics of the property market? And they are population growth and movements. When people move around, and this is quite easy to see how that happens, they will have an effect on property prices. And the other one is purchasing power. So if people can afford to borrow more, then prices will go up. We've seen that recently. And of course, some people will downsize, and so they don't need to borrow, but they have great purchasing power as a result of that. So they're sort of the main top-down dynamics. But when you look from the bottom up, it's more about the basic numbers, looking at sales listings and rental vacancies and confidence that people have in the market itself.
When we think about the top-down stuff, you talked sort of about purchasing power. Now, of course, with low interest rates and banking sort of having a reasonable appetite for lending, obviously that brings a lot on the table. But do we also kind of think of that purchasing power in terms of what the actual price is in that particular market? So if Sydney becomes way less affordable than a regional location, then that's going to drive price movements in that area?
It can do. It's what we call the ripple effect. And you find that this happens all the time when prices go up. So first home buyers have a certain borrowing limit, and so they'll just move to the next suburb and where it's more affordable for them to buy a property. But when you're looking at those sorts of movements, it's always important to realise that it's got to be the same type of area. In other words, if it's a first home buyer market area, that the next suburb along is the same type of market and not completely different. But then you will find that does happen. And there is an upper limit. At the moment, I've estimated that prices have had the capacity of going up by about 25% this year because people have been able to borrow more. And the reason they can do that is because the banks have lowered their floor rates. So, they're willing to lend you more money based on your capacity to repay the loan. And that's occurred pretty much all over Australia.
There's been an argument in Sydney where the dwelling price to sort of income ratio really should have stopped a decade ago. Like, property prices were just too expensive that nobody could afford them on the average wages, even as inflated as they are in Sydney. But is that a bit of a flawed metric when you kind of think of intergenerational wealth going into the mix? Like, how do we sort of factor that into the research?
Well, I think it's a fallacy to look at the overall price of a property because no one actually fronts up with, $1 million or $1.2 million. And there's a lot of first home buyers paying up to, $1 million for properties. It's the affordability in terms of how much you have to pay every month back to the bank. That's really the critical thing. And so with interest rates being at their lowest and as I mentioned, the floor rates have been dropped by about 2% over the last year, it means that banks say, yes, you can afford to make the repayments. And of course, you're not looking at the overall price, which to us, I've been around a long time, and to me, $1 million seems like an absolute, ridiculous amount to pay for a first home. But the affordability is based on the repayments.
Sticking with those top-down metrics, when you talk about movement, obviously, I was hoping to go this whole podcast without using a word like unprecedented because we're sick of it. But people have moved, right? We've seen a bit of an exodus from the cities to the regions. We've seen the rise of the working from home stuff. I joked on air about downloading your wisdom pre-pandemic about what was going to happen in the next 12 months. But people obviously pulled the rug from under you. How much of that has changed movements and how does that factor into researching markets?
I think the first thing that's happened is closing of the international borders has meant that we haven't had people coming into Australia in the way that they used to. So most of our population growth was derived from overseas arrivals, and that's all stopped. So we've had a few expatriates come back, but that's about it. So that is going to have a profound impact on property markets in years to come, because these people, when they arrive, they're renters for about 4 or 5 years, and then they become first-home buyers. And cities, especially places like Melbourne, are going to be sort of suffering the effects of that decrease in demand. But on the other hand, you've still got people moving, even with our international borders closed. You've got people moving interstate. So in the last 12 months, there's been a net migration of people from New South Wales and Victoria to Queensland, which is really quite interesting. And that's about half of Queensland population growth in the last year has been from people coming from southern states. And the other thing about that is that the two types, you get younger people moving from Sydney and Melbourne into Brisbane, and they're mainly renters, and then older people have been moving into more the regional markets around Brisbane. So, and they're, of course, property buyers, in many cases, retirees.
So we've seen population growth really, I guess, the lowest it's been for a long, long time because the borders are shut. We've seen some migratory movements from let's say the colder states to a warmer state. How key are those two metrics, the population and the interstate migration, to use sort of zeroing in on saying this is a region that I think is got some interesting potential?
Well, when you look at the last example I made, which is people moving interstate, especially younger people moving to Brisbane, predominantly renters, then you can look at the state of the Brisbane rental market and see that it's pretty much in balance. So if you get a lot of people moving in, that's going to create rental shortages, and so rents are going to go up in many of the inner urban areas in Brisbane. And also when you look outside that to the regional markets where older people are moving as property buyers, what you're seeing there is tremendous increase in buyer demand in places like Bribie Island, the Fraser Coast, the Gold Coast. And so property prices there have really started to take off, and that's likely to continue.
Yeah, certainly those areas that they conjure up quite pretty places in the mind have done really well. The sea change, tree change sorts of areas, which have always been quite popular for retirees, but even the working from home revolution has made them achievable places to be. Now as well. When you talk about the bottom-up metrics when it comes to research basics, are those all of the things that we would probably see in those property magazines, like your vacancy rates and your vendor discounting and that sort of stuff?
Well, they are, but there's really only a few that are very important. One is if you're looking at sort of areas where a lot of renters live, well, then it's the rental vacancies and the way they're trending, and that's very easy to track because you go to realestate.com.au or Domain and just simply look up the number of rental vacancies in a suburb. The other one is the number of listings, that is properties listed for sale. So if I give you an example of that, Mike, it's There was a town in the southern New South Wales and Riverina called Hay, which has a population of around 4,000 people. And some years ago, a lot of the local farmers decided to move from different types of farming to actual cotton farming because there were new varieties that they could grow that far south. Now, the Cotton Board, Oscot, decided to build a cotton gin in Hay. And to do that, they would need to employ about 160 people from other areas to come in and build this gin. So that meant that there was probably an increase of around 160 families moving in to rent for a few years in Hay. This was on the ABC News, so it was something that, we saw and thought, oh, that's interesting. Looked up the number of rental vacancies in Hay, and there were 2. So I thought, well, that means if 160 families are going to move in and start renting, rent demand far exceeds the supply. Therefore, rents are going to go up dramatically, and they did. And within a few months, of course, investors saw that you could get 15% rental yield in Hay, which is phenomenal, and they decided to buy properties and get that cash flow. Now, when we looked at the number of properties for sale, there were only about 3 or 4. So that meant, of course, that investors started bidding against each other to buy these properties, and property prices doubled in 7 months. That's the best prediction I've ever made. A lot of people saw that and took advantage of it. And so property prices doubled in 7 months, and they stayed that way for about 2 years. And all that time was positive cash flow investments for these lucky people. So just by looking at those 2 indicators, you could get a really good idea of what was likely to happen.
That's really interesting. And I suppose post that growth, you've also now got a new big employer in town that has a benefit in the longer term. So how replicable is that? Is it a matter of following the news to look for these big infrastructure or investment projects or that are going to have a disproportionate impact on the town? Like if you put that cotton gin in Penrith, it wouldn't have the same effect as it does in Hay. Is this something that we can be trying to find happening again with relative ease?
The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
There is, and I think in general you'd look for the bigger infrastructure projects and in particular transport improvements. One good example of that was the duplication of the Pacific Highway from Newcastle all the way up to the Brisbane border, which is over 1,000 kilometres. And as the work progressed, we could see that as they did the bypasses around Kempsey, Taree, Port Macquarie, all those areas, that the workers had to move in and start renting properties. And so rents went through the roof because there simply weren't enough rental properties available. But then a second thing happened, which was once the highway duplication was completed, these areas suddenly became faster to get to, easier and quicker to access. And so they became more attractive to retirees and other property buyers. And so prices went up 30, 40% in a year or two. So you could track that as you saw the duplication proceeding. And the only area left now is around Coffs Harbour. That's the only part they've got left to do. So then you look, well, where else are these sorts of projects undergoing? And places like the Bruce Highway, which is from the Sunshine Coast all the way up to Cairns, that's being duplicated. So you can follow that progress. Down south, the Princes Highway from Narra down to Sussex Inlet is being duplicated. So the same thing is likely to happen there. So you can just pick towns and see when the work is likely to start. Construction workers will move in, and when it's finished, then buyers are more likely to buy properties. So it's a pretty easy thing to track and to profit from.
Yeah, I mean, you can almost track that from space, can't you? You follow the road, and these things are highly announced, and politicians love to talk about all the money that they're spending on making it quicker to get from A to B. So I guess that's a pretty easy thing to do. I want to sort of ask you about the stat about the average investor still only owning one property. Do you see property market research basics as to be part of the problem, that people are just sort of going on a whim, or they're purchasing around the corner, or they're getting sucked up into the latest media article and not just looking at the basic fundamentals?
Yeah, so I think that overall people tend to see, buying a property and looking for the growth as being the only thing they have to achieve. But there's another side to this, and that is cash flow. And when you buy your first property, if it's negatively geared and costing you money every month, then you go to buy your second property and you go to the bank and they'll say, sorry, you haven't got the capacity for a second property loan. So sometimes people get to two and then the same thing occurs. So it's very important, and when you're looking at property as an investment, you've got to look at the cash flow side as well. And positive cash flow is really the only way that you can keep on increasing your portfolio, because you're getting money from these properties, net money in rent every week. And so the banks are more willing to lend you money to buy more properties. The other thing about that is that these areas, they might not be areas where you'd want to live yourself. And a good example of that is when we looked some years ago around the highest yielding areas in Australia, and one of the highest in Tassie was a little suburb called Risdon Vale, which is it's on the eastern shore of Hobart. So it's an outer suburb of Hobart, had the highest rental yield in Tassie. And I thought, why on earth is that occurring? So we went and had a look, because we also like to do on-the-ground research when we're looking at markets and things that don't seem to make sense. So we went there, and the first thing we noticed in Risdon Vale was this huge maximum security male prison. It's where all the bad guys in Tasmania, when they end up in jail, that's where they go. And we thought, well, who would want to buy a property here? Because, you've got the sirens at night and the razor wire and everything, and it's just a terrible place. And yet it was full of people who were renting, and they were the wives and the girlfriends and the families of the people who were in the jail. So they were renting there while their husbands or partners were serving time, so that they could take the kids and have visits or have conjugal visits with their partners. So the rent demand was always high, and that's what caused the high yield, and that in turn made it one of the best investment areas, and so it's also had very high capital growth. And the thing about that is that, of course, the more violent and crime there is in Tasmania, the higher the rent yield is likely to be in Risdon Vale.
That's an awkward thing. I mean, you wouldn't want to go out inciting violence just to get some better performance on your property. But
well, you wouldn't. But if you're an investor, it's funny how these things work. And you think, I'd never want to live there. And that's really not the point. Other people do. And that's what creates the demand.
That's all that matters. Do you have some stories about investors that you've known have got the research basics done well, that have been able to extricate themselves from that stat of only having one property and maybe getting to the 4 or 5 with their research nailed?
You can do that as long as you're buying in areas that have got really good imminent growth potential. We'll have to pause here a sec. I'll just clear my throat. All right, we'll cut that bit out, Mike.
I'll ask you again if that's all right.
Okay.
So, John, do you have any examples or stories where you've worked with investors or come across investors that have got the research done well and they've broken the mold and been able to get the portfolio up to 4 or 5 just by really nailing those research basics?
It's certainly possible, but I've discovered one thing about property investing is if you do it correctly, it's a great rewarder, but if you do it wrong, it's a very savage punisher, and it's very hard once you've made mistakes early to get out of that, but it can be done. there are areas in Australia which our research identifies where property prices can go up, phenomenally in a few years. And we've identified areas like Hay where property prices have doubled in less than a year. We've had investors buying places like Berry where they went up 100% in just 1 year. We identified Byron Bay as another good example when you could buy a house there for $500,000 and 5 years ago, and now the median price is $1.5 million. So those sorts of investments will get you out of trouble, but it's always very important to try and avoid making mistakes in the first place. Make your first investment one that's going to reward you with growth and cash flow.
Yeah, look, if we could sort of try and, I guess, bookend this episode by coming back to your top tips. So for people that are very close to purchasing their next property or their first property, what are the best tips that you can give them to find an area that's going to put them on the path to a high yielding portfolio? I don't mean yielding. I mean a high growth and yielding portfolio.
I think the main thing is to look at areas that have got the best imminent growth potential. And in this, I'm probably at odds with some other people who will say it's all about time in the market. You've got to invest for a long period of time, buy and hold. And I say, well, if you do that, you'll probably end up with about 8% growth per annum over time. Your property value might double in 9 years, but that's not really good enough. And so you've got to look for areas where you're fairly certain that you're going to get really high imminent growth. So I'd be looking at these areas where people are moving to, and retirees are likely to move to, and people moving interstate, where they're moving to, not where they're moving from. And those areas will give you much better returns in a shorter period of time. So that's, the first secret, I would say, is use the information that's out there to find areas that have got the best growth potential in the shortest period of time.
Yep, beautiful. So is there anything else that you would, in closing, sort of say, apart from looking at the areas that are going to be in demand because you can see people moving there because they're retiring or it's a lifestyle destination, and it's just got that X factor to it? Is there anything else that you would highlight to say this is a key indicator that there's an imminent positive thing about to happen?
Well, I don't think there's any one key indicator. I think there's a number of them, as I've mentioned. But if you want more information, you can go to our website, lindemanreports.com.au. There's a lot of blogs and videos on there, a lot of free tips, insights about what we've just spoken. So in far more depth, you'll get a lot more detail about the different techniques and tips that I will provide to investors quite freely. And also, if you'd like a free consultation with me, that's available. You can book one in if you go to the website, free half-hour telephone conversation. So that's there if you just simply go to lindemanreports.com.au to take advantage of.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. And we're asking you to download all of your wisdom on property market research into 20 minutes. It was always going to be a tough ask, but you've given us a really good insight into some of the top-down indicators and the bottom-up indicators that investors need to understand to make sure they're purchasing with a good plan for getting that imminent growth and the good growth over time. So thank you very much for coming back. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Mike, and good luck, everyone. I wish you all the best of success.
Thanks, John.